To part two of our lecture on Chapter 4, Multicultural Considerations and Assessment. In the first part of our lecture, we were really focusing on our definitions of multicultural assessment, as well as defining fairness and bias in the context of assessment. And for this second part of our lecture, I really want to focus on the cultural factors of assessment and how they show up. So, one of the first areas that we have to consider in the context of assessment is how we show up in the room with our clients, because there are many cultural factors that will influence our assessment process with clients, that might include introducing bias into the assessment, as well as the counseling process and outcomes. And it almost always starts with our very first interaction with a client and how that interaction sets the stage for the work that we are going to be doing with them. And there's a notion that who serves in the counseling like role for individuals varies across cultural context. So that means that as counselors, it's important for us to explore with our clients who plays a salient role in their lives and then should be included as part of the counseling and assessment process. So that can include people like grandparents, siblings, church leaders, tribal elders, community members, whatever it looks like. That can vary widely across cultures, and we as counselors need to make sure that we are taking that into consideration and processing that information with our clients. It's also important for us to understand that there are three levels of the counselor client relationship that foster positive working alliance throughout the assessment process. The first of those is the conceptual level of relationship. And at the conceptual level, each member's perceptions of the other's honesty, motivation, and credibility are really assessed by both people. At the behavioral level, both the counselor and the client are looking at the degree of competence that each of them brings into the counseling session. So, this can include things from the level of training, therapeutic modalities, what assessment measures are being used, as well as the ability to follow directions and implement skills that have been learned. And the third level of the client counselor relationship is the cultural, which is the amount of cultural sensitivity and competency each person, both the client and the counselor, brings to the counseling session. And we talk about this in the context of assessment because it doesn't always occur that this amount of awareness is given to the multicultural aspects of what makes us us and the unique things that we use to identify ourselves. And when that happens, we can experience discrimination. And discrimination occurs in the counseling relationship when counselors intentionally or unintentionally use cultural group membership as the explanation for assessment findings. So, in the context of the work that you're going to be doing as an assessor, this could mean reducing someone to only their group membership in order to explain why they are scoring the way that they are on their assessments. It is our responsibility to be multiculturally competent and to be ethical assessors and to take every aspect of a client's identity into play, as well as additional pieces of information. Our clients should never be reduced to just their group membership in interpreting their assessment results. Oftentimes, when discrimination and bias occur in assessment, we as counselors can fall victim to diagnostic errors. And these can occur with culturally diverse groups in several different ways. First, counselors can overdiagnose marginalized group with more severe diagnoses. For example, historically, individuals who are African American and Latinx are more likely to be diagnosed with psychotic disorders. Individuals who identify as women are more likely to be diagnosed with personality disorders, and people with less formal education are more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. The second way that we can engage in a diagnostic error is by underdiagnosing particular groups, especially when particular behaviors are expected of a group or we completely misdiagnose them. If the presenting concerns do not align well with the traditional Western-based criteria of a particular diagnosis. So you'll note that I described the particular criteria of diagnosis as being Western based, and that's because the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the DSM, was made out of Western ideals. So all of the criteria that are in the DSM are more Western based. And what that means is that some groups can be particularly underdiagnosed because they're presenting in ways that don't necessarily match the way that the criteria are written in this Western based ideal. So, an example of this is for individuals who are African American, they are often diagnosed less with depression than individuals who are white. Individuals who are Asian American are potentially not being diagnosed with depression because they may display only somatic symptoms of depression. And again, these are just examples and they don't apply to everyone, but you get the idea of where underdiagnosis and misdiagnosis can come into play. Because the third area of diagnostic error is misdiagnosis. And this occurs when we are attributing the symptoms of a diagnosis to something completely unrelated. Historically, one example of this is that individuals have been misdiagnosed with intellectual disabilities when in reality they're presenting with symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. And this misdiagnosis rate is particularly strong for individuals who identify as African American. So it's important to talk about these things because the prevalence and incidence of mental disorders are disproportionately higher for racial and ethnic minorities and other marginalized cultural groups. And these disproportionate rates are not likely representative of actual rates because counselor discrimination plays a role in how counselors misdiagnose. Mental disorders, however, can be exacerbated by discrimination clients experience both within and outside of the session. So that means it is our responsibility as counselors and assessors to discern if the client's responses are due to more generic stressors such as job loss or the death of a loved one, or if their responses are a result of discrimination. And it's our responsibility to navigate that and take that information into consideration when we are conducting an assessment with someone. Client motivation and the degree of test familiarity may oft also be a likely reason for assessment score differences that we see. So, when we're talking about things like client motivation and test familiarity, this can be how often someone has been exposed to a test. Do they have access to materials to study? Do they have exposure to that material in school? Also, is the test sophisticated in a way that they're used to? And oftentimes, we see that client motivation and test familiarity can explain a lot of score differences, particularly for racial and ethnic minorities, when we're talking about standardized testing. So, for example, we have to ask ourselves in a session whether or not our client is comfortable demonstrating their skills to a stranger. Are they motivated to do that? Are they comfortable and familiar with that? Is there an element of competition that's involved in the assessment process that might contradict a client's cultural upbringing? And that could then interfere with their motivation to participate in the study or in the assessment. We also need to ask ourselves if the assessment is in a language that that client understands. Is it their first language? Is it the primary language that they speak? And is that going to influence their familiarity with the test? And we also have to ask if there's a pressure to perform at a particular level in order to gain entrance into prominent universities or colleges or schools. because all of these things can play a factor in how motivated a client is to participate in a study, as well as how familiar they are with the content. Another cultural factor that we have to consider with assessment is acculturation and the role that it plays in our interpretation of assessment results. And acculturation is another cultural factor that we really could spend weeks talking about. But for the purpose of this class, I want to just go over it briefly to provide a framework for the rest of our time together. But acculturation is really the extent to which an immigrant or someone from outside of a host country integrates his or her own, their own country's value system with that of the host country. So, acculturation level is affected by the number of years that a client has been in the acculturation process, the age at which they began that process, and the client's country of origin. And there are four predominant acculturation models that are talked about in research. The first of those is assimilation, which occurs when the client identifies only with the host country's values and practices. The second model is the separation, which occurs when identification with the country of origin's values and practices is the only aspect of focus. So a client only focuses on identification of their country of origin. We also have integration and biculturalism, which is when the client identifies with the values and practices of both their host country and their origin country. And we also have marginalization, which occurs when a client rejects the values and practices of both their host and their country of origin. And it's important to remember that clients can identify with more than one model, and they can ascribe to one model in varying degrees. There are a few things that we can do to better meet clients through the acculturation process while conducting an assessment. And one of those is what we call the Cultural Assessment Interview Protocol, or sometimes it's just shortened to the Cultural Formation Interview, or the CFI. And this can sometimes be a useful tool for gauging acculturation and other culturally relevant information during the assessment process, particularly during the background interview or the intake. And I added a copy of the Cultural Formation Interview that is provided through the DSM on Canvas, and I want you to read through it and review how you think you could implement it into your own practice of assessment and even just working with your clients. There are also some cultural factors around test translation and test adaptation for language, because there are limited English language proficiencies in assessments, and the lack of appropriate test translation services can have a detrimental effect on the assessment and counseling process. However, a lot of research evidence shows that administering assessments, particularly ability tests, in a client's native language is linked to higher achievement scores. So, it's our responsibility as counselors to make sure that we are providing our clients with an assessment in a language that they understand and that is their primary language in order to best capture their skills. And we can do that in a couple of ways. Some assessments are directly translated into other languages, and when they aren't, there's always the option of asking for a translator. And if you are going to use a translator as an assessor, you need to make sure that you do your research. Our textbook actually has a great breakdown of questions that you need to ask yourself about accessing a translator, and I wanted to go over just a couple of those with you. But primarily, you want to make sure that you are finding a translator who matches your client's racial and ethnic background and their linguistic expression, because it can vary widely depending on where a person is from. And the closer you can get to the client's identity, the better connection you're going to have with the translator being integrated into the process. You also need to make sure that your translator is versed in mental health issues so that they are prepared to translate the content that you are about to share with the client. If you are selecting a translator, it's always best in the assessment process to have the translator be someone that your client doesn't already know. So don't have a family member, a friend, or a just loved one of your client be the translator, because it can create this layer of bias in the interpretation of results, especially if the results might not be favorable for the client. You also want to make sure that you are speaking in a way that matches what the translator is needing. So, typically, the process for using a translator is to use short, concise sentences and to give the translator time to speak. So, it might start with counselor says something, translator says it to client, client responds to translator, translator gives the information to the assessor, and then you repeat the process. And you do so through short, succinct sentences that are easier to follow. So that's test translation. We also have test adaptation, which refers to the ways that we change an existing assessment tool to meet the needs of cultural groups not included in the original standardization sample, so the normed group for that assessment. Test translation is different from test adaptation in that test translation is truly translating a test into a different score or a different language, I apologize. Whereas test adaptation is making changes to an assessment to meet the needs of the client. So, a really good example of this is in some of the abilities testing and achievement tests, there are language tests that require you to say as many words as you can think of that start with a specific letter or that are all of a certain category of like furniture or fruit or a particular gender's names. And what you can do in terms of test adaptation is change that information to meet the client's needs. So if that letter is not a common letter in the client's language, you can use an alternative letter. If that category is a novel category, then you can change it to one that is more familiar to the client. And that's a version of test adaptation. And combined, both test translation and test adaptation can be really useful tools for addressing some of the limitations that are associated with language barriers in the assessment process. It's also important for us to talk about gender when it comes to assessment. And I really want to start this by cautioning all of you on assessments in terms of gender, sex, and sexual orientation, because our field of assessment is not as advanced as we would like it to be. Namely, most of the assessments that are available today are limited to binary genders and binary sex categories. And when it is implied, when there's any romantic relationship or interpersonal relationships implied in the assessments, they are almost always implied to be heterosexual relationships. That means that a lot of the current assessments that are out there do not account for anyone who's non binary or who has an expansive gender identity, anyone who is intersex, and anyone who has any sexual orientation besides heterosexual. And that means that as counselors, we have to use these assessments with caution and fully explain them to our clients. There are some assessments where the output for the assessment is going to be norm based on gender. And when you're putting in the information, the assessment protocol might actually ask you to select the client's gender, but then the options are sex categories. So it says select your client's gender, and the options are male or female. So it's really important to converse with your clients about what that means in the context of just inputting their scores, but also how that varies the norm based material that they're receiving. But if we move beyond this caution, we do see that there are changes in assessment scores based on gender historically. Namely, we see that there really isn't a significant gender difference for scores on intelligence tests. But there are tests of specific aptitudes, such as mathematical and verbal ability, that continue to show gender differences. Namely, we see historically that individuals who identify as women tend to perform better on verbal abilities, and individuals who identify as men tend to perform better on measures of mathematical ability. And although some individuals have historically argued that there are innate gender differences in intelligence, more recent research shows that these differences are likely related to stereotypical attitudes held by each gender and its ability, and the individual abilities that we're talking about. It's also helpful to know, at least in the context of societal progress, that these differences in aptitude tests based on gender have decreased over the last 40 years. So it seems like the stereotypical messages about gender around abilities seems to be leveling itself out. We also do see that there are gender differences in career assessment. And a lot of times, these gender differences are likely related to item bias as well as cultural beliefs about gender appropriate career paths and how those beliefs are internalized by and expressed by the individual who you're assessing. So, what this means is that there isn't necessarily a biological superiority of gender over the other. And actually, we're not saying that at all. What we are saying is that there is a difference in career assessment results based on gender that are likely coming into cultural beliefs about both the jobs and our gender identities and how those things interact with one another and then how they are expressed. So, cultural beliefs that influence career assessment process can influence then the career decision making process that someone goes into. And it's interesting because psychometricians have tried to minimize their item bias in career assessments by providing some separate same sex norms for scales. But again, this is limited to a binary view of gender and sex. So, additional ways that psychometricians have worked to eliminate gender bias in career assessments is by eliminating sexist language. And this change has actually occurred across the board for career assessments, which is pretty cool. So items like mailman and policeman were changed to postal worker and police officer. And they've also started including items that would be equally attractive to all genders. So instead of saying, I have a strong desire to care for children, the item might be changed to, I have a strong desire to be a teacher of elementary school. So that the items are more applicable and attractive to people regardless of their genders. And a frequently offered argument across the board in assessment is that intelligence tests and other measures of cognitive aptitude are constructed by and for white middle class individuals and therefore are biased against lower socioeconomic individuals and others who may not be part of the majority culture. And you've heard me say this before, and part of that comes out of the history of assessment in just its development, but also many racial and ethnic differences in scores on aptitude and intelligence tests disappear when socioeconomic status is controlled. And the socioeconomic status is significantly correlated with race and ethnicity. So that means that a lot of times the differences that we might be seeing in assessments based on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status can actually be controlled if we would provide everyone with equal access to materials in basically being able to control the influence of socioeconomic status. It's also interesting because it's not clear really what shows the significant differences in intelligence tests between individuals who are white and individuals who are African American. And there's actually a really interesting quote in our book that The differences between mean intelligence scores of blacks and whites does not result from any biases in test construction and administration, nor does it simply reflect differences in socioeconomic status. There is certainly no support for a genetic interpretation, and at present, no one knows what causes this differential. And I think this is a really important way for us to highlight that we see these differences, these racial and ethnic differences in ability and aptitude and cognitive testing, but we don't know why they exist because they sometimes do remain after we control for socioeconomic status, and other times they don't. So we really have to take into consideration that available research indicates that the groups are going to perform equally well on ability tests, and any differences that are occurring, we don't have a great reason to explain why. Additionally, research indicates that there are racial differences for career assessments as well. Specifically, that individuals who are members of racial and ethnic minorities may endorse fewer career options as they may not have expansive exposure to various careers. And that means that interest inventories are going to show different results by racial and ethnic groups, but that those tend to have similar predictive value across the different groups. So, even though there might be a difference based on race or ethnicity for a preference for a particular type of career, whether or not that interest is displayed or that difference in interest is displayed, both groups, regardless of where their interest was different, are still going to have predictive validity in that they're probably still going to find joy in a career that matches what they identified as being of interest to them. Although there is a lot of controversy regarding bias in tests, and a lot of that has centered on aptitude and intelligence tests, we can't omit that there are certain tests used in counseling, such as interest and personality measures, that also have not been free of bias. Specifically, racial and ethnic differences exist for personality assessment measures, yet variables outside of race and ethnicity, like socioeconomic status, education, and intelligence, seem to be important determinants of performance on personality assessments. So, an example of this might be that individuals who are Asian American, particularly those who are not highly acculturated, tend to report psychological problems through somatic complaints and tend to underuse counseling and mental health services, which can then change personality assessment results accordingly. There's also mixed findings for personality assessment score differences between individuals who are Latinx and whites, but most of the score differences disappear with proper test translation for Spanish speaking individuals. So, what this means is that if we are able to put tests in a context and in a language that makes sense for our clients, we can minimize the differences that we're seeing across groups on personality assessments. Also, individuals who are Native American, no matter their age, gender, or education level, tend to have higher scores on numerous mental health assessments, indicating greater mental illness, which is likely largely because of oppressive experiences that these individuals have experienced. And I highlight all of this because the differences that we're seeing on personality tests among minority groups and those of cultures are to be expected. We would expect there to be differences based on oppression experiences, based on differences in languages. And it's our responsibility as counselors to take those differences into consideration while we're interpreting personality test results, along with other test results like our ability and intelligence tests. So that is where we're going to wrap up the second part of our lecture on Chapter 4. You can join me for the third and final lecture in the next one.